I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty. So many times we come and we have this show that's put together simply with my wife and I talking with various guests. Tonight, my wife is actually sitting in the audience, and I get just to look at her. So if I get tired of looking at Greg, I get to look at her, and I probably will look at her most of the program tonight. But I'm going to be all ears listening to Greg. We have as our guest tonight Greg Brahe. He's a biologist who is an atheist, but I really don't want to emphasize the idea of his atheism in the show unless he wants to. The purpose of our show here tonight, and I simply asked him to come on the show because I think that most people are missing the point when it comes to what evolution is. For instance, in various educational paradigms, let's just pick on homeschoolers. In most homeschooling textbooks, when it comes to science, most of the science is pitiful, to say the least. I picked up an Abeka book a few years ago and looked at various textbooks, that is, science books in particular, and we had all these Bible verses that were basically in rhythm with what was being stated. And this really bothered me. This is actually published, this particular textbook is published, I think, here out of Pensacola, at Pensacola Christian College. They actually pontificate that the Abeka system is the best textbook system and curriculum that should be supplied to homeschoolers. And there are thousands upon thousands of homeschoolers here in America. And most of these families are very, very conservative. And I would think, and I really don't know the statistics here, maybe someone can correct me, most of these people are actually Republicans, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not trying to side with the Republicans or the Democrats. I'm simply trying to do something tonight that may give someone a bit of an education, because I want people to understand that this is not an argument between what Greg believes and what I think to be true. This is not a show for that. This is simply a show that will actually offer an explanation of evolution from the standpoint of a well-trained biologist. And this well-trained biologist is Greg Brahe. And so I would like to welcome Greg to the show. How are you doing, Greg?
I am fantastic. How are you today?
Doing very well. My wife and I are always amazed at your show, Inspiring Honesty, with you and Bob Greaves. You guys are doing a wonderful job at making points, and I think the most powerful thing about your show is that you're demonstrating that you just don't want to talk, but you want to listen. And you keep giving theists and all kinds of other people an ear, and you're wanting to be objective, you want to be honest, you want to actually inspire honesty, and we applaud you much in every way.
Thank you. That's what I try for.
Tonight, I want to state a position that is our position clearly when it comes to creation and evolution. My wife and I really applaud the idea of evolution. We do not think that the Bible technically even teaches creation in the classical sense or in the traditional sense, or I should say that is as defined by the fundamentalist. And this is something that we will cover in a subsequent show. But tonight I would like for you to speak, and you may take one of these didactic approaches and simply speak and speak and speak and speak, and then we could ask questions at the end. But I want to really emphasize that our target tonight isn't the one who has been to college or the one who has already been through the educational processes. I've asked Greg to come and present a case for evolution for people who do not have a college education. For instance, homeschoolers need to hear this kind of content. Everyone who hasn't been in the classroom to hear the arguments from various professors need to hear what Greg is saying tonight. And so I'm going to give you the mic and allow you to, or ask you, I should say, to do what you do best, and that's to speak about evolution.
Thank you. Excuse me. I hope I can do it justice. I have to say, it's been a while since I've made a formal presentation of this nature, and I've been preparing it for a few days, but I have not practiced at all. I wrote it, and I wrote an outline. I have some notes, and I'm going to do my best to maintain eye contact as I can. I will have to refer to my notes on occasion. And I wanted to let you know sort of the way that I've lined it up. I do intend to take a little bit of the pontificating approach, if you will, where I unfortunately I want to get through what I need to get through before we can take questions. I've tried to plan it so that it shouldn't take too much time, because I think the discussion is fantastic and that we'd like to get to it. Unfortunately, if I take questions in the middle, it can sometimes derail the entire thing and miss some of the really important aspects of what we need to get through for people to fully understand this. So I've written it in a way that should, or hopefully, should be accessible to people that don't have a scientific background. But I'd like to start with the disclaimer that I studied evolution for several years. It's a very detailed and very nuanced theory with a lot of evidence, a lot of support, a lot of different fields of study that all converge on supporting that it is, in fact, the most accurate understanding that we have. But I need to try to boil that down into something that I can present in a reasonable amount of time here. So with no further ado, I think I'll jump right into that, unless you have anything else to say before we get it started, Dr. Jones.
Okay. If you have a question, if you would be so kind as to simply send it to our text number, that would be 850-572-7441. Go ahead and text in all of your questions to that number. Now, I'm going to be doing several things at the same time that Greg is teaching. I'm going to be corresponding with Joey with all the various questions, because we want to make sure that those people who really don't know what evolution is, I want every question to be answered. That is, from the standpoint of those people who have never been through this before, because I really think that this show is going to serve as a model, if you will, as an educational model for many, many people. And so I'm encouraging Greg and the rest of our audience simply to be patient, and let's go through the process of learning. And by the way, I hope that you can see that the place here at the New Covenant Group, we are very, very supportive of an educational paradigm. We think that this is wonderful. And so I'm not going to take up your time, Greg. Simply do what you think to be best, and we are all ears and applauding you.
All right, thank you. Well, I wanted to start then with a definition of terms. Being a linguist, I'm sure you can appreciate, and the audience who's used to you can appreciate how important it is that when we're using language, language is not inherently exact in itself. So I'm going to define what I mean through science specifically. This is the generally accepted viewpoints of what these words mean. I actually got these definitions right from the National Academy of Science. It's been taken essentially from a pamphlet that was put out for how to teach about evolution. So there's four things I wanted to hit on right away that are words that are commonly used and used very differently in common language than science. The first one is fact. So the definition here, or the description, I guess I should say, is a fact in science is an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed and for all practical purposes is accepted as true. Truth in science, however, is never final, and what is accepted as a fact today may be modified or even discarded tomorrow. So what I say by fact, or when I use the term fact, I mean it is accepted as true, but nothing is absolute. If something comes up that upends everything, we have to take the evidence as it is. In science, the only thing that is considered reliable is the evidence. Our theories, our hypotheses, even our facts and laws, they're all derived from the evidence. So if the evidence comes that upends something that we consider to be a fact, it means we need to change our consideration. The next term is hypothesis. Hypothesis in science is a tentative statement about the natural world leading to deductions that can be tested. That's important. A hypothesis is not just a simple conjecture as you would use in normal language where you throw out a, what if aliens were the ones that built the pyramids? That's not testable. That's not a hypothesis in science. So if the deductions are verified, it becomes more probable that the hypothesis is correct. If they are incorrect, the original hypothesis can be abandoned or modified. Hypotheses can be used to build more complex inferences and explanations. So hypotheses are tools in science. It is a testable conjecture that we come up with, a statement that is a dependent statement, if and only if, or at least an if statement, or if-then statement. The third term is law. A lot of people think about gravity, the law of gravity. Well, that's absolute because it's a law. And again, that's a failure of common language versus scientific. In science, a law is a descriptive generalization about how some aspect of the natural world behaves under stated circumstances. What's interesting about laws in science is that they tend to be less accurate than several other things. They're models. We put a law together that describes, say, the law of gravity is that 9.8 meters per second squared is the acceleration under gravity. And that's a generalization. It doesn't take into account any wind resistance. It doesn't take into account elevation differences. There's many different things that could potentially play a role. And it's not a perfect 9.8 meters per second squared. That is used because it's simple, it's easy to understand, and it's close enough to be highly reliable in science. That's what a law is. So when people say the law of gravity is more absolute than the theory of evolution, what they're missing is the next term I'm going to define. That is theory. In science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world that can incorporate facts, laws, inferences, and tested hypotheses. In science, a theory is as high as it goes. There is nothing more elaborate than a theory, more concrete than a theory. A theory can be modified. It can be changed. Any aspect of it. As I said, a fact can be changed. And if a theory depends on a fact, or if a fact is part of a theory and that fact changes or is found to be incorrect, then the theory changes in its own way. But the theory itself is a very large body of explanatory information, or it's a method of understanding facts, laws, and confirmed and abandoned hypotheses in a total framework that helps us understand it. So if you've ever heard somebody say evolution is just a theory, remember that there's the law of gravity, but there's also the theory of gravity. And evolution is better understood of a theory than gravity is. As a matter of fact, the Higgs boson was just tentatively defined. It's not even absolute yet, or discovered, proven, as it were, in science. And that is the origin of gravity, the origin of mass. So we've understood things along the line of evolution far better than gravity for quite some time. Okay, through with those definitions, the next ones I want to get through are, and this will be it, but I need to define life. Life has several definitions, and it's very important that we understand what we're talking about it. I tend to use the biological definition of life as a biologist. But because there is no unequivocal definition, there's a few things that the biological definition takes into account. The first one is homeostasis. That is the regulation of the internal or environment to maintain a constant rate. For example, the salt content within a cell can be different than the salt content without a cell, or outside of a cell. When you swim in salt water, your body doesn't suddenly take on the same salt consistency that the water has. You don't, if you fall into some raw sewage, you don't become raw sewage in the same way that if you threw Jello into there, it would happen. Um, that is the concept of homeostasis. It's a contained, controlled environment. Next one is organization, being structurally composed of one or more cells, the basic units of life. And even within the cells, there's more organization beyond there. That's not necessarily part of life, but organization in and of itself is necessary for life to happen. Next is metabolism. That is the transformation of energy by converting chemicals into cellular components. That's a very technical definition, but metabolism basically means using energy to do work. Energy taken in either from the sun or from some other chemical that you've ingested or somehow taken in. There's also growth, which tends to be beyond growth, that leads into reproduction. So physical growth, but also reproduction, growth beyond yourself into propagation. Adaptation, the ability to change over time, and of course, response to stimuli is an important part of life. If there is absolutely no response to anything, even bacteria responds to certain kinds of stimuli. So this is the biological definition of life. If something meets all, or in some cases most of these criteria, it is considered to be alive. There are things in biology that aren't necessarily considered to be alive because of definitions like this. Take, for example, viruses. A virus cannot reproduce on its own. It needs to infect another cell to be able to reproduce. A lot of people do not consider, myself included, do not consider viruses to be alive. They're very real, and they do still evolve, which is interesting in its own right. But this is the biological definition of life. The other definition that we will use a little bit is Kaufman's definition. Kaufman is a biologist and a computer scientist who really upended and changed the world of evolution in the, I believe it was late 1980s, early 1990s, using computer models to show that things can spontaneously organize and do. It's incredible with things like starlings, the way that they fly, or cell development during embryogenesis and early life. It's incredible the way that small, minute interactions between cells can create macroscopic changes, and it's not from any central planning network. And Kaufman is the one who really helped us to understand that. So he defines life, this is a very simple one sentence long, as an autonomous agent that is something that can both reproduce itself and do at least one thermodynamic work cycle. So again, according to Kaufman's definition, viruses are a little sketchy in there. But aside from that, I challenge anybody to come up with something that is considered to be alive and does not fall into that category. So those are my definitions of terms. I wanted to give one final bit for what life is from my own perspective as well. Life, in my perspective, is continuous. What I'm about to lead into is the concept of universal common descent, that all life that exists on Earth today, all life that we know of currently, came from a single origin. And when I look at life that way, it helps me to think of life as a continuous event. When I die, life doesn't end. My life ends. My life began, but life is not affected by me and me alone. Life is started since the very first life began, and never once has that chain been broken, which I think is an incredibly beautiful aspect of the theory of evolution. Is it explains how life has changed over time, and how it's diversified, and how it has become everything that it is today. So with that, I wanted to move into the idea of the universal common descent a little bit more, and tell you a little bit about the history of that as well. First of all, as I mentioned, that means that it is all life that is known today. It comes from a single original point. There's a lot of evidence for that. However, this is a testable hypothesis. if there's the evidence that we have found in every situation has always supported this. But it would be pretty simple to find an organism that has a completely different concept of life. As a matter of fact, they thought they found one last year. Structure for life, different nucleotides, different polymers that they make their proteins out of, or even not using proteins, using a completely different chemical structure. These would all be indicators that this is not the same kind of life that we are. Maybe it's from an alien source. We don't know. But as far as what we do know, and this is, by the way, not controversial in any way, there's not a single biologist that I'm aware of that does not believe all life is comes from a common ancestor, except for occasionally human life. And that's, I think, a travesty when people can't admit that they are part of the animal kingdom as well as able to understand it. But there is, like I mentioned, a lot of evidence for this. As I said, the polymers, meaning proteins, and the amino acids, the building blocks, nucleotides, adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, are used. That's 4 nucleic bases that make our entire genetic code. There's uracil in RNA, but otherwise it's the exact same thing, runs through a very, very simple chemical structure, and it's used for everything. What's interesting about that is they could very easily be configured in different ways and work just as well, but they're not. It's simple that even the nucleotides that we have, chemically speaking, could be arranged very differently and do the exact same thing that they do, but they don't. And the fact that's true is very, very strong evidence from the fact that we all inherited that trait from a common ancestor, that it started a long time ago, and we don't do it different ways because why reinvent the wheel? It's been said that this is also evidence for special creation, and I can understand that. A single God would certainly not reinvent the wheel either, I'd imagine. If you have a system that works, why not use it? But there's some other things that play a role in here as well. Some other pieces of evidence, and very falsifiable, very understandable ones, such as vestigial traits. Eyes that exist in animals that live in caves and are completely blind. There's occasionally eyes that are even buried under several layers of skin, but they're still eyes. Now, if that animal was created and did not evolve from a previous ancestor that had need for those eyes, why does it have eyes? It lives in a cave. The eyes don't work. Same things with wings on flightless birds, or things like the appendix in human. Yes, the appendix can serve a function to an extent, but if you can remove an appendix in a person and it does not change anything in their life. As a matter of fact, it may increase their life expectancy. There's also things called atavisms. These are similar to vestigial traits, but these are cool. I love atavisms because they're the things that you hear about and think, weird, how does that happen? Things like people with tails, or whales with legs, dolphins with an additional set of fins where their legs would be. These are things because their ancestors had these traits, and there's still the genetic potential for these things to happen. And they pop up every once in a while through odd mutations, generally in how the genes are expressed, instead of in the genes themselves. But it's an incredible evidence that we share a common ancestor. When you see a whale, and these have been found, there's pictures recently, not skeletons, but true living caught whales that have a leg hanging off of them. Not a flipper, but a leg. There's humans that have tails that move and have muscles inside of them. And that's pretty strong evidence that at some point human ancestors had tails and whale ancestors had legs instead of flippers. We don't ever see fish with legs. It's only the mammals in the ocean that have them. So, the fact of universal common descent is about as established as anything else. But that doesn't tell us how any of that happened. And that's where the theory of evolution comes into play. The theory of evolution is relatively new. Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859, so just over 150 years ago. He was 50 years old at the time. From what I understand, waited a long time to publish the book because of the implications. But he was not the first person to consider evolution to be a fact. As a matter of fact, this is something that as far back as Aristotle, or Plato, evolution was considered to be true to some extent. Plato, he had an interesting idea of it. He was I'm trying to remember the exact word for it. He had a creation-based concept of how variety in nature comes about. That was the allegory of the cave. Basic idea being, imagine yourself chained up in a cave where all you can see is the back wall of the cave. And there's something casting shadows on this cave. Now, unless you have seen the function of shadows and how they work, you would never understand that that's a shadow and not the real animal, or even what the real animal truly looked like. Plato believed that animals had a true form, and what we were seeing in nature was simply a shadow of the true form. He was an essentialist. There is a real zebra, and every zebra that we see is a shadow of what the real zebra is. This falls in very well with the creation idea from the Old Testament of each animal according to its kind. And that's used very often by creationists to deny evolution, is that dogs give birth to dogs and horses give birth to horses. You've never seen a horse suddenly become a monkey. And that's an extreme misrepresentation of how evolution works, but we'll get to that. The next person, Plato's direct student was Aristotle. And Aristotle was the first person who came up with the idea of it was the scala naturae, the hierarchical ladder of life, saying that things changed with time. And as they changed, it was a development because they were striving to get better. And man is the top of that ladder, that we grew. Every animal that existed in the past wanted to get better, had a desire to improve. And men, humans, are the top of this ladder. He ranked the development of life. Things like, I mean, at the time they weren't even aware of bacteria, but your jellyfish were near the bottom of this ladder, whereas things like mammals were much higher up it. This was the idea that persisted for a long time. Now, mind you, this is 4th century BC. This is over 2,000 years ago that people were talking about this. Through St. Augustine in the 5th century, yes, it's St. Augustine of the Catholic Church. He also recognized that forms transformed over time in the same way that Aristotle did. He was the first person in the Christian tradition to make such a statement. And actually, St. Thomas Aquinas made a similar observation, expanding on St. Augustine a full 8 centuries later, saying that not only do these animals develop over time, but it makes sense that they do, because obviously a prudent creator that wanted to make a ship, if you were all powerful, you could create a tree that grows into the shape of a tree, or into the shape of a ship. It grows on its own into that shape. And he had that same concept for life, that life could be planted by God and develop into what it is today. He warned against taking a literal interpretation of Genesis in the Bible, and thought that it made far more sense that a divine creator could create life in a way that it would have everything in it that it could develop into what it is today. None of these really got into how it happened, other than the idea of striving to get better, or striving to improve, or having a divine plan for how to get there. So, and many of them, I should say, either excluded men from the natural process of life, or humans from it, or made sure that we were the peak of it. The first person who really came up with a theory that went beyond just the God's plan, divine plan, or striving for something better. Well, I guess that's not even really fair. it was just beyond the divine plan, was a man named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And Joey, I have a picture for this one. This is the Lamarckian evolution picture. This was the predominant theory of evolution before Charles Darwin wrote his book. Now, this book was published in 1809, 50 years before the origin of the species. This is a contemporary of Darwin's to some extent. The book was published right about the year Darwin was born. He grew up with this, and his father, I believe, actually worked with Lamarck to make this theory, his father Erasmus Darwin. In this one, the idea is that acquired characteristics are passed on to your offspring. The picture, is it up right now? Okay, the picture should show giraffes. Okay, thank you. Stretching, striving to reach the higher and higher and higher leaves up on the branch. And every time they're stretching for it, their necks get a little bit longer. So when they have children, those children are born with this acquired trait that they have longer necks than their parents did because their parents worked so hard to get these longer necks. Of course, the problem with this is amputees have children with 4 limbs. If I have my gallbladder removed, that doesn't mean that my children will not have a gallbladder. That didn't seem to be too big of an issue at the time, but Charles Darwin had a problem with that. And during his studies of both the geology and nature as it is, and he was a naturalist, cataloged thousands of animals on his journey across aboard the Beagle, through the Galapagos Islands and the South America, and it took very, very meticulous notes and made a lot of detailed drawings of what he saw. And he came up with a revolutionary idea that evolution does not happen at the individual level, that I don't evolve, you don't evolve, no person, no animal evolves. You are born and you die, and anything that happens to you during your life is, biologically speaking, gone when you die, unless you've reproduced. Reproduction is a way that you can pass on what you are. And the reason that becomes significant is because not everything reproduces. As a matter of fact, for Darwinian evolution to work, most things need to not reproduce. A large majority of things need to die before they can do it. And evolution, it can be cruel. It is a hard process. And if you look at all of nature and most of human history, there's a lot of very brutal reality to how evolution does and has occurred. But let me go from there into when evolution does not occur, because I think that really helps to bring about the understanding of why it does occur. There's a concept in ecology called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This would be the situation that we would need to have for no evolution to happen at all. There are, I believe, 7 notes on this, and they're put together. I made a little picture so you can read them with me here. It's the first clause is that mutation is not occurring. We'll get into mutation a bit more later and what exactly that is, but essentially it means the genetic stock that is there is pure. It is not changing. The next is that natural selection is not occurring. That would be part of Charles Darwin's theory. The natural selection of any kind is basically it means that anything that can mate does mate, or mating, the ability to living to reproductive age is not in any way selected. It is entirely random. The other one is that the population is infinitely large, or I prefer to think of it as sufficiently large. If you have a very, very, very large population, you don't need to worry about evolution happening. All members of the population breed. That's what I was saying with the natural selection not occurring. That it could also be said that breeding is entirely random. There is no selective force within the breeding. And that's actually the very next clause. All mating is totally random, because natural selection is not the only kind of selection. I think that it becomes pretty obvious if you look at people that people don't mate randomly either. That there's certain traits that are selected for in your reproductive success, as it were. So the same is true in the animal kingdom. Look at a peacock for a moment, and you can see just how simple of a concept sexual selection is. Um, Everyone produces the same number of offspring. This one's very important. If some animals in the population are producing explosively and some have one or two, then that can really change how things work. And the last one is that there is no migration into or out of the population. The genetic stock that is there remains there, and it remains pure. If something leaves, it could evolve wherever it goes to. If something new comes in, that's introducing new traits. So that is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and how it can be possible for no evolution to occur. I hope it's obvious how difficult that actually is. Evolution is almost impossible to avoid. And it leads into the next concept of what is known as the Red Queen theory. The Red Queen theory comes from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where in the original book, the Red Queen needed to run all the time just so she could stay in the same place. And the idea with that is, or the reason it's used in evolution is because that's absolutely true in life as well. For a species, a population to survive, it constantly has to be adapting. There's an arms race out there between predator and prey, and that includes plants are prey to herbivorous animals. So predator and prey happens there. If you've ever eaten a habanero pepper, don't try to tell me plants don't try to defend themselves. So there's changes that happen with time, and it happens on both ends of the spectrum, or in all ends of the spectrum at all times. And if you ever stop evolving, you are very likely to go extinct. And often extinction is the only way to truly stop evolving. I did want to bring an example. I went to Costa Rica when I was doing my undergrad, and I did some personal study there. It was a service group as well, but I took some pictures while I was there of a plant called the bullhorn acacia. This is a fantastic example of coevolution. Things don't necessarily evolve to or against each other. Some things also evolve into each other. I do have a picture of that. I don't know if it's up at the moment, but the bullhorn acacia is a plant. It's a tree. They don't get too big, but it's a woody plant. The center stalk goes out, little green leaves, and it has these big horns on it. You'd think, looking at them at first, that those are thorns, but in reality, they're too big to be a practical thorn, and they don't happen all over the place. They really happen at certain joints of the tree where branches come off. And if you look closely, there's little dots and sort of an undulating pattern, usually 3 or 4 with a dot in the middle. These dots secrete a substance that it's sort of like a sap or a nectar. And those horns that are on there are hollow. These acacia have an ant that is a very related, specific, it is the acacia ant, a species of ant that lives exclusively in these trees. And what's interesting is the tree houses them and it feeds them. And in turn, the ants defend the tree. If that tree runs into another tree, if they come into contact with another, ants pile onto that tree and they will eat its leaves off. They will destroy it until that entire tree is dead, so it does not take up nutrients from this little acacia anymore. This is an example of coevolution, where two things have changed over time, and you can see how it would work. When ants go into a tree that naturally, for some random mutation or random trait, happens to have these hollow horns in it, then they have a house. They're likely to stay there for longer, and things defend their territory. So if one of these plants that naturally has these horns, well, that one's going to be more successful in breeding anyway. It's going to have more plants with it, and the ants that have these houses are going to be more successful as well. So now one of these randomly happens to generate something that secretes some sort of food for these ants. Now they not only have shelter, but they have food there. It's a trade-off. there's mutations. There's no such thing as a purely good mutation. Even this mutation that would give these ants food and give them more incentive to stay, that costs the plant. It has to produce this food for them, so that takes more energy. But in turn, it gets protection from a lot of things, and they've dovetailed together. Um, in the long run, nobody understands every detail of the evolution of any particular thing, but that is a fantastic example of two things that have evolved together for such a long time. It's really difficult to see any other way to explain that um, than, well, than divine creation again. But we will get into that a little bit more. But the divine creation versus evolution idea. But um, mutation is something that I had touched on earlier, and that I just explained a little bit more. I wanted to say a mutation is poorly understood in the general public. Anybody who's seen the X-Men seems to think that mutations give you superpowers, or they make you into monsters, or um, who knows. But mutations are not what they have been portrayed to be. There's many different kinds of mutations in a genetic code. It is six, well, realistically 6 billion base pairs long. That's a human genetic code, has 6 billion base pairs. That's a duplicate, so it's 3 billion here, 3 billion there. They are paired chromosomes, and those base pairs mean that it's the adenine, guanine, thymine, or cytosine, single nucleotides. A mutation is when something is being copied. Your DNA, it's a double helix. It works like a big zipper. And your body has proteins in it that unzip it, and they copy both sides of it when your cells are reproducing. So you end up with two brand new strands of DNA that are both exact copies of the previous one. Sometimes something goes wrong with that. Sometimes the new one that's being made, instead of putting in adenine, puts in a thymine. That's random, and it happens about 1 in every 50,000 duplications, which is very, very low frequency, but it happens. And when you're talking about the scale of 6 billion, 1 in 50,000 means about 120 of them every time a cell reproduces. That's a lot when you consider your cell or your body is made up of trillions of cells. Um, to get from those two ideas, we need to understand that a point mutation is only one kind of mutation. That you're replacing a single thing, and that single thing could be nothing. It could not change anything at all, or it could change the structure of a protein to a very small extent. So maybe it's shaped a little differently, and that could make it better or worse at doing what it does. Odds are, if it changes it at all, it's going to make it worse. Most mutations are bad. The large majority will either not do anything, or they will hurt the function of life from that. So when you go into positive mutations, we're already talking about a small amount, but they accumulate over time. There's also large mutations, things like frame shift mutations, where instead of taking a single adenine and replacing it with a thymine, you just cut it out and you shift everything else from that single point in your DNA strand up one. It's only important because the way that your DNA works is in 3-letter words. They're called codons. So if you shift one, every single word or codon from that point forward on that DNA strand and that gene is now different. That is no longer anything like what it was before. You could have completely different amino acids. It can completely change the structure of that protein. That's significant. That makes a huge difference. Frame shifts are almost always, the word is deleterious. They almost always kill you. They're bad. In fact, 1 in 3 pregnancies in humans ends in spontaneous miscarriage, or at least that's the commonly accepted number. Some say 1 in 5, but somewhere between 20 and 33% because of things like frame shift mutations, or the other one is duplication. Duplication is when an entire gene or an entire chromosome is duplicated. It's thrown in. Anybody who's ever met a person with Down syndrome, that is a duplication. That is called trisomy 21. That means that normal human genomes carry pairs of chromosomes, and there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. People with Down syndrome have 22 pairs of chromosomes and one triplet. A triplet happens in the 21st chromosome, which is ranked arbitrarily, but that is, it manifests in all the ways that you've seen with a person with Down syndrome, and it's harmful to their health in many ways. People with Down syndrome don't tend to live as long, especially without modern medicine, where they have chronic health problems. And as I said before, they're significant changes, and they make a big difference. So most mutations that are maintained are point mutations, not chromosomal duplications, or at least in human lineages, chromosomal duplications or copy or duplications for parts of genes. So you think, well, how does a tiny, tiny change in a protein make this big of a difference? I mean, for something, the common ancestor of chimpanzees, to lead to lineage that is now chimpanzees and lineage that is now humans, that's a huge difference. It's because our point mutations don't happen all at the same time. They don't all affect us at the same time. A mutation that affects something that you only do as an adult affects things very differently than what happens when you're a child, and when your body is developing. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Right now, I did want to touch on more the results of this than the mechanism, and this is the idea of micro versus macro evolution. Microevolution, I have never met even a creationist, a young Earth hardcore creationist, who does not accept that microevolution is true. I say that this is a fallacy. There's no true difference between micro and macroevolution, but what microevolution means is change in a species over time, or change in gene frequency over time. Oddly enough, the biological definition of evolution is change in gene frequency in a population over time. So it's one and the same. The difference is nothing but a time scale. Microevolution means small changes that things like antibiotic resistance, or how you have to get a different flu vaccine every year because the flu virus modified and adapted. It's still influenza, but it's different than it was last year. This is microevolution. And macroevolution is considered speciation events, when something goes from a single species and now it becomes two. I have a picture for this as well. Speciation comes in, I like to think of it as three ways. This image has it in four ways, but I want to go over what each of them is. The first one is allopatric speciation. That means you take a population. Say you have all of the zebras in the world, and they all live, there's no zoos, they all live in Africa. And now you take Africa and you chop it in half, and you put a 10-mile wide river in between them. There's not a zebra in the world that can swim for 10 miles. Those two populations are effectively separated forever. And as long as that's the case, they will both continue to change and to adapt to their environment with the accumulation of random mutations. So even if their environments are extremely similar, random chance is going to push these mutations in different directions. And eventually, given a long enough amount of time, they will not be able to come back together and interbreed effectively in any way. Now, interbreeding is not necessarily the only way to consider something to be a species, but it works. It's functional, so that's what I'll be sticking with today. The next one is parapatric speciation. There's also peripatric. Difference being that peripatric is when a small portion sort of buds off. Parapatric is when it's just a large enough range that the things on this side can't breed with the things on this side because there's 1,000 miles in between them and they don't move that far. So eventually you end up with almost a gradient in between, where this one might be able to interbreed with this one, and this one can interbreed with that one, and this one can interbreed with that one, but this one cannot interbreed with this one. Too big of a difference over the range of it. The last one is sympatric. Sympatric speciation events are cool. I like sympatric speciation events because they are true, honest, immediate speciation. And these have been observed and they've been shown They tend to happen in plants and amphibians. Frogs were what I studied mainly when I was going through school. So I did a large amount of research on frogs, and I find them fascinating. But what's interesting with frogs and with many plants is that polyploidy, the duplication of chromosomes, like Down syndrome in humans, doesn't really affect them in the same way it does humans. Plants have a good amount of this, amphibians do, but even right here in Wisconsin where I live, there are two species of tree frogs. Um, the first one is the eastern gray tree frog, or tree frog. The second one is Cope's gray tree frog. I've caught both species of these frogs, and I've examined them next to each other, and you can't tell them apart. They look the same. The only way I could tell them apart was when we did a chromosome squash, and we looked at them, at the karyotypes. Exactly, we looked right at their chromosomes under a microscope, and I could say, wow, this one has twice as many as that one. One of them is what's called a tetraploid. It has, instead of chromosome pairs, it has chromosome quadruplets. The entire genome of this frog was duplicated in a single animal, or possibly a single generation, a single breeding event. And suddenly they survived. These babies were a completely different species than their parents. That was a situation where a frog of this species gave birth to a frog of a brand new species. And that's cool. I think that's fascinating and fantastic. Doesn't happen in most animals because, or most plants, because that kind of a shift in your genetics can do a huge amount of damage. But overall, it's possible, and it has happened. And these are true, honest speciation events that have been observed in nature. So, aside from that, there's only two other main concepts that I wanted to get into in this idea, and that is that of convergent versus divergent traits, or homologous and analogous traits. Homologous traits means my arm and a dolphin's flipper and a bat wing. Those are homologous traits. The bones are the same. You can see I have a radius and an ulna. A bat, the radius and ulna have fused for most of the arm, but towards the back it separates again. You can see that it was at 1.2 separate bones. They have the finger bones that we do, but their fingers have been elongated. Dolphins have been changed so that their fingers are stunted, but they have the same bones, and you can tell. You can watch them develop into this from their embryonic stages into what they become as adults. The other side of it is the analogous traits or convergent things. That is things like beaks. The duck has a beak on it that is very similar in many ways to the duck-billed platypus. Those are not traits that came about from a single morphological common ancestor. They evolved, both independently evolved their bill. The same is true of wings of a bat versus wings of a bird, or wings of an insect. Wings, just because they're wings and they serve the same purpose, does not mean that they came from the same traits. So that's the difference between convergent and divergent evolution, or analogous versus homologous. So I spent some time talking about what evolution is. I did want to talk more about why it matters and how we know we can trust it to the level that we can, and why it's even important that we care. The first one is that it's useful for prediction. In science, again, hypotheses are useless unless they tell you something that you can go, oh, this is how this works. A fantastic case study of this is a animal that has been dubbed Tiktaalik. I do have a picture for this one as well. But this was discovered in 2004 by a team of paleontologists. What's cool about this one is these paleontologists were looking for this fossil. They didn't know it existed. This is a transitional fossil if there ever was one. They said, okay, we have this fossil of a fish and this fossil of a reptile or a land-dwelling animal. We are looking for something that is an intermediary form in between them. Based on where we found these fossils, based on the time frames we've seen them in, we're going to look in this area of the world in this strata of rock, this Devonian period rock, and we're going to find, or hopefully find, this animal. They got really lucky. They found 3 specimens that were extremely well preserved and showed a perfect blending of the two. These were true transitional fossils, discovered only back in 2004. So this was really incredible stuff, and it was done entirely with prediction. They said if the theory of evolution is accurate and common ancestry is accurate, we should be able to deduce where these things would be and where we would find them. And it turns out they were right. That is incredibly strong support that these theories are very, very sound. But it's not just in archaeology that it's important. It's also, we touched on antibiotic resistance, vaccines, flu viruses. Epidemiology and immunology are they're highly dependent upon evolutionary theory, particularly antibiotic resistance. Now everybody's told, make sure you take all of your antibiotics. 20 years ago, they used to prescribe antibiotics as a placebo. So people would take them for a few days, and when they felt better, they'd stop taking them, and they didn't worry about it. Now we know that that's bad. We've made such an antiseptic culture that we're killing all kinds of the bugs that we used to get, and now we're ending up with bacteria that are almost impossible to kill. Anybody who's ever heard of MRSA or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is very common in the medical field, that is a really, really, really hard to kill infection. If you get that, you've basically got it for life. They can keep it under control, but they can't get rid of it without some massive systemic antibiotics. And that's evolution. That is that bacteria. What happened is all the ones that didn't survive these harsh treatments we were throwing at them died, but some of them did, and they developed into what we have today. So there's also a quick case study on this of another coevolution thing that I think is really cool. Parasite resistance. Malaria is a mosquito-borne illness, and it infects your blood. It is actually a parasite. It infects red blood cells. The African population has a much higher instance than would be expected of sickle cell anemia. Now, if that's a mutation. If I had sickle cell anemia, not living in an area with high malaria infection rates, it would be bad for me. There's 2 ways I can get that. One is when I get it from both of my parents, and now I have full-on sickle cell anemia. The other one is when I get it from one parent, and the other parent has a normal red blood cell gene. This is actually the situation that's selected for in Africa, and actually in India, it's done the same thing in an analogous way. It's not from the same trait, but what happens with sickle cell anemia is your blood cells, when the oxygen content gets low, they change shape, or in the heterozygous form, where you get one good one and one bad one. So you have a normal, round, disc kind of shaped red blood cell. It looks almost like a jelly donut. And then suddenly your blood oxygen goes low. That happens when these get infected with parasites. This cell can't hold as much oxygen as it could before. So it goes from this to this. It becomes sickle shaped, and hence the name. And they clog up, and then your body gets rid of them. Now, if that's what all of your blood cells do, that's really bad for you. It can kill you. If some of your blood cells do that, it really reduces the amount of infection, makes it a whole lot easier for your body to handle, and you can survive it. All of your infected blood cells go away. Your good blood cells stay where they are. And it works out to be a really, really good thing for those people. So even though sickle cell anemia, when 2 people that are both carriers for it or half have it, have children, they can get kids with the full-blooded one, and that's bad. It still ends up saving itself just because malaria is so prevalent in those populations. So that is another example of completely natural and random. However, everybody knows of kinds of evolution that are not completely natural and random. And you may not think of it as evolution, but it is. One of these is wild mustard. You don't really think about eating wild mustard. Not a lot of people do, but you do. I promise you, you have eaten wild mustard before. I have a picture for this. This is selective breeding that has been done with the wild mustard plant. And this one plant, through suppression of certain traits or selecting for certain traits has become, I need to look at the picture here. I forgot to note which ones it became, but it has become broccoli, cauliflower, kale. I'm not pulling up the picture here on my computer, but it has been forced into all of these different species that we use now. And it all came from that weird looking little wild mustard plant. So that was done with selective breeding. Selective breeding you're also very familiar with dogs, farm animals. If you've seen a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, you can see the power of selective breeding. But it's the case for almost all of modern agriculture. There's a video I want to show you as well that brings about an interesting point of selective breeding. Joey, are we able to do that video?
Yes, we are.
All right, fantastic. It's a minute long. It's pretty quick, or a minute and 14 seconds. I believe it is Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron, both very fundamentalist creationists. But go ahead, roll the video here.
There are 3 ridges. On the close side, 2 ridges. If you get your hand ready to grip a banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 grooves, on the close side 2 grooves. The banana and the hand are perfectly made one for the other. You'll find the maker of the banana, Almighty God, has made it with a non-slip surface. It has outward indicators of inward contents: green, too early; yellow, just right; black, too late. Now, if you go to the top of the banana, you'll find, as with the soda can makers, they placed a tab at the top. So God has placed a tab at the top. When you pull the tab, the contents don't squirt in your face. You'll find the wrapper, which is biodegradable, has perforations. Notice how gracefully it sits over the human hand. Notice it has a point at the top for ease of entry. It's just the right shape for the human mouth. It's chewy, easy to digest, and it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier. Seriously, Kirk, the whole of creation testifies to the genius of God's creative hand.
So, the banana is proof of creation, and that video actually was titled when I saw it, and I believe Ray Comfort opens it by calling it the atheist's nightmare. It shows there's absolutely no way that we could possibly have a banana without divine creation. And I wanted to point out something. I have a picture. This is a picture that another one I took when I was in Costa Rica. This is a wild banana plant. It, as you can see, looks very different from this banana. The bananas are shorter, they're fatter, they're really only green. They don't turn yellow in the same way that these do. They go from green, they do get yellowish, but then more of a mottled brown, and they sort of go from green straight to brown. What's really interesting, though, is that those bananas they can be eaten, but they're very difficult to eat. They're tough. They are very seedy. They need to be taken apart. And I mean, you can eat the seeds if you want, but they're tough seeds. These bananas, if you've ever noticed, I know I never have, and I doubt anybody in the audience ever has eaten a banana like this and suddenly gotten a seed in your mouth. And that's weird. This is the fruit of the plant. Fruit of plants is made to carry seeds, but these don't. These are a mutation. They were not selectively bred because they can't be, because they don't produce seeds. Every banana plant in the world today is a product of modern agricultural techniques, where we take a cutting of a plant and we start it with new roots and we plant it into the ground, and it then creates a new, it propagates itself. They are all clones, as it were. They evolved to some extent again, but not much, given that they're not being cloned from a single cell. So the atheist nightmare is ironically the creationist nightmare. This is a example of not only evolution, but the importance of human intervention within it. One final point I wanted to make: the easy open tab on top of a banana, that is the wrong way to open a banana. When you open from this side, it gets stringy, it doesn't break easily. And how many times have you come and had that little black nub that stops in the bottom? The way to open a banana, you pinch the bottom and open from there. Opens, you don't get the strength, much better. But I digress. I'm going to eat that later. So, bananas fantastic example of why evolutionary theory is important in agriculture. But then it does also apply to dogs, to cows, to horses. I mean, you've seen the Clydesdale versus race horses versus so many other different kinds of animals are chosen for specific traits. And people want to say that a dog is a dog is a dog. But in nature, yes, right now, we could breed a Chihuahua with a Great Dane. That is possible, generally through artificial insemination. In the wild, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane could no longer ever interbreed. The height difference, simply they just couldn't do it. And even if they could, the size difference would probably be fatal for the female if it was a. Anyway, they are effectively different species in nature now. We have created different species from what we've done. The evolutionary model is applied in many different fields. Economics, computation, linguistics is another one that it's very much used, where we can actually do a phylogenetic tree of life of languages, and we can see the Germanic languages and the Romantic languages and see how they've developed over time. And it's cool, but evolution is useful in so many different things. And I wanted to go to one final note before we sort of wrap this up here, because so far I've just been talking about the theory of evolution in itself and how it works. I haven't really talked about human evolution in a way. And I actually have a quick story. It was written by Richard Dawkins that I wanted to share. It is called, it's from the New Scientist, written back in 1993. But the idea is a human chain. It starts with events. He talks about how events are sometimes put together where people hold hands for some sort of cause to show how long of a chain that you can make to do something and show solidarity. And he says, imagine a situation like that, only instead of humans living today, it was mother and daughter in an unbroken chain. You have a mother. Your mother has a mother. Your mother's mother had a mother. Now, if it was possible, your mother could hold hands with her mother and back that way along the chain, giving a yard per individual. Richard Dawkins has done the math to make this work out over the course. Say you're standing on the east coast of Africa, at the Horn of Africa, and you're holding hands with your ancestors in this chain. Your mom is holding hands with the exclusively female ancestors in her chain. If she looks to her left, or if you walk 100, 200 yards down this chain, and you look to your left and your right, you're going to see nothing but people. They're all going to look similar, very similar. I mean, they're all family, but they're going to look like people. As a matter of fact, as far as your eye can see, you're likely to only see people. What's interesting, though, is if you walk down this chain about 300 miles, you're going to see something that looks like a bush baby or some sort of small monkey-like creature. And you're going to see a very, very gradual change over that 300-mile trek to that animal, because that is the unbroken chain of life. And when people talk about it, well, if humans evolved from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? Or if humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? That betrays an ignorance of the theory. People did not evolve from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are a cousin. In the same way, you and your cousin did not come from one another. You share a common ancestor. The difference is just how far back you go on the chain. My cousin is somebody that I share a grandparent with. My second cousin is somebody that I share a great-grandparent with. My cousin to the 10 to the 10th, I don't know what to call that one, but if you go back 100 or so generations, we're looking at a very different family tree. We're looking at, let's see, that's about the time of Christ. Now, people were still people back then. So if we go back 100,000 years, that's when it's thought that humans became humans, that was when Homo sapiens emerged. But if you continue this back, go back 3 to 5 million years, that's where the branch happens. The branch between modern day humans and modern day chimpanzees. Now, there have been other branches along this chain on the way, and that's a mom holding on to two kids, two daughters whose lineages will never ever meet again. That is a branching point. And one of those happened for chimpanzees and humans. And it happened about 300 miles down this this chain of moms. And this small monkey-like creature is holding the hands of two of her babies that look exactly like her. And if you imagine these chains then go straight down, facing each other, you can walk down this chain and you look to your left and your right, and you see brother and sister, and you see cousins, and you see close relatives. But the farther you get down this chain, they start to look a little bit different from each other. And now you're a mile down this chain, 10 miles down this chain, 100 miles down this chain. You're a third of the way down lineages that became humans and lineage that became chimpanzees. They're going to look pretty significant. They're pretty significantly different. When you make it all the way, you end up with chimpanzees that we have today and humans that we have today. This is why we look similar in many ways, but different. This is a very well established phylogeny. That's the word that talks about the tree, how things branch. But what's really interesting, something that not a lot of people recognize, is that not only are chimpanzees our closest living relative, but that means we are chimpanzees' closest living relative as well. We are more closely related to chimpanzees than either humans or chimpanzees are related to gorillas. That branch happened further back. So even though chimps and gorillas look far more similar than chimps and humans do, we are more closely related to chimpanzees than we are to gorillas. And that has been established through many, many different forms of verification between genetics and the morphological traits. And it's very, very well established. We do have a picture of that phylogenetic tree. I don't know if we put that up yet, but the way that a phylogenetic tree works is it branches with time. So when you have branches happening, anywhere you see a single point and it goes off in two directions, it does not matter which way you flip those. You can flip them one way or the other, and everything is still perfectly equally related. This and this are the exact same relation to this. So you can flip them between them. You can do the same thing here. These three are all the exact same relation to this one. So this would be humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. Or chimps, humans, gorillas, and orangutans. That's how that tree works. So the question is, how did we end up looking so different with just the accumulation of small mutations over time? And the best way to understand that is when you look at not adult forms. Adult forms are not how we start off. They're not the best representation of the power of genetics, but children, specifically infants and even earlier as the embryos. If you look at the infant skull of a human next to the infant skull of a chimpanzee, we actually have a picture of that. And that is a remarkable difference when you compare them side by side from what you would see between comparing a adult human skull and an adult chimpanzee skull. There's another picture that shows the human and chimp skull development. And what that does is it plots it over a grid, and then it shows these points get anchored out and stretched with the grid. And you can see the distortion happens between a human skull from childhood or infancy to adulthood versus a chimp skull from infancy to adulthood. And if you notice the major difference between the two, it's that human skulls human adult skulls look more like human baby skulls than chimp adult skulls do. Our skulls look like children's skulls. That is called paedomorphism, or I forget the other term for it. I always use paedomorphism, but neot would be the other word. That explains a huge amount. It's about gene expression. In rats, they found a single point mutation can double the size of a brain. They don't know if that affects intelligence, but again, these point mutations, there's things like Hox genes, that a single mutation in a Hox gene can mean an extra pair of ribs. It can mean an extra section of abdomen in a centipede. That's how centipedes got the way that they are, is Hox gene duplications. They just repeat. And our genes not only code for proteins, they code for gene expression and how things work, when they're turned on, when they're turned off. And that can make a huge difference in development. So even though a gorilla and a chimp look more like they're closely related than a chimp and a human do, remember, if you look at the very, very early stages of us, it's much easier to understand how closely humans and chimpanzees are related to one another. That's essentially what I have for the presentation here. I do have a set of controversies that I went through and gave basic answers to, but frankly, I ran about the time that I wanted to with this. I don't want to go through the controversies on my own without taking questions, comments, or anything else I can do at this point. So thank you for bearing with me. I tried to make it as interesting as possible. With that, I'm going to say, Dr. Jones, did we have any questions, comments, or anything I can help other people with?
We have lots of people who are applauding what you're teaching, and I find that to be really, really positive. I think that theists are starting to think, and I speak as a theist, and I'm very, very proud of theists starting to come to the table of discussion, that is, in an honest way. You've done a wonderful job tonight. I can't applaud you any more than I have. I do have several questions that have come in, and I'm trying to keep the focus here tonight, not in a complicated context. And Bob Greaves is going to join us in just a couple of minutes, because I think that there's some discussion here that could be had that would be extremely beneficial. And so, Joey, if you would pull Bob on to the show. Right. But there is a question that came to me directly, and this was a reference to what a lot of homeschoolers do read. Homeschoolers often read Wikipedia. And in Wikipedia, under the term evolution, it states life on Earth originated and then evolved, etc. And I would like for you to explain that in very simple terms to our homeschooling communities. We have various people who do homeschool, and then we have Christian schools. We have all kinds of people that are educated in various ways. We have proprietary educational institutions. And so if you could address this, I would appreciate it, because I simply want our children, if we can think about this show as giving advantages to our children, that is in the context of education, that is in the context of evolution. And so could you address this? Life on Earth originated and then evolved, etc. Could you explain that, please?
I don't know exactly how to explain that, other than yes, that's accurate. Life on Earth, the theory of evolution does not deal specific with, and I should say neither does the theory or the fact of common descent, common ancestry, deal with the origin of life explicitly. The Kaufmanian definition of life does deal a little bit more with it, in the fact that any self-replicating molecule could be considered alive as long as it's doing some sort of metabolic function. And I'd imagine replicating yourself counts as a metabolic function. So in and of that itself, we don't know how life originated.
So it should be clear to the student, that is to the child who is studying evolution, that evolution, those people who are articulating the premise of evolution, it really does not suggest an origin. Is this correct?
Well, I'm hard pressed to say it in exactly that way. I would say that it suggests an origin, but it does not explicitly state one. The theory of evolution does not rule out the possibility of a special creation of life, even panspermia, the idea that life on Earth was seeded here some way from something else. That's an infinite regression. We'd have to figure out where it came from originally. But yes, it is entirely possible that life, as far as the first self-replicating organism, was divinely created. However, the theory of evolution would suggest that that was unlikely, that it came about naturally in the same way that life evolved from that point through an entirely natural process to what it is today.
There's another question that came in. How much of science is building upon the premise of evolution these days?
A lot. It's hard to say anything other than that. It goes way beyond biological field, but I was going to get the quote and I forgot to mine that one out today. But there's a rather famous quote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. All of modern medicine, of modern understanding of life in every way, as I mentioned, agriculture, breeding, these are all very dependent upon the theory of evolution and how it works and its predictive powers. If it weren't for the fact that we understand it to the level that we do and can say, well, if it does work this way, we should be able to breed these two champion racehorses and come up with a champion racehorse or better. That's an evolutionary hypothesis. And if it never worked that way, if we end up with a random horse, then that might call this into question a bit.
How much of science ignores evolution and simply has a completely different paradigm?
Very, very, very little. And I mean this outside of even the realm of biology. As I mentioned, there's economics is a scientific study to some extent. Sociology involves quite a bit of game theory and things that are group dynamics. Evolution is a very, very powerful theory in its explanatory capabilities. And unless we're talking about something like a very, very, very physical science such as chemistry or physics, they tend to rely pretty heavily on biological processes or similar biological processes such as evolution. I'm a biologist, so I can't speak for every field in that way. But I think that my background in science in general is probably broader field than the average, and I can say that it's used in many, many different ways. Engineering, again, even computers. There's plenty of systems that use evolutionary models to, say, do text-to-speech or image pattern recognition, the facial recognition software that's come out. Those all use evolutionary models. So again, very, very powerful, and there's very little of science that is in any way model-based that is not somehow linked to evolutionary theory.
One of our viewers sent in a comment, is there any evidence that evolution inevitably and ultimately leads to intelligent life?
No, there is not. And actually, that's one of the controversies and things that the common misunderstandings of evolution is that it has a goal or it has a direction, and it doesn't. Evolution is a process of not dying. That's all it is. Evolution is selected for one thing, and that is life. The propagation and continuation of life in whatever way it may be. That is how, through evolution, we've ended up with wolves and sheep, and we've ended up with parasitic wasps and the caterpillars that they inject their larvae into, which then take over them and make them into zombies, and horrible things that happen because it works. Because somehow or another, this organism developed this random mutation or this random behavioral pattern, or it survived better than the other ones of its population. And it because of that, life goes on. It continues. And there's no end game. There's not a direction. The only direction is for life to continue. It's the only thing that's selected for it all.
Okay, another question is, lots of people really don't understand lots of the terms that you used in your presentation, and yet they want to trust you. But what convinces them, and this is often true, what can you tell people about the premise of evolution? How has it benefited us today? For instance, I think your example of the banana was wonderful. Can you give us maybe 10 or 15 different ideas of how we have been blessed with this theory of evolution and how it has benefited us? What is it doing for us in a pragmatic sense? In other words, that's what people are looking for. If I start believing in evolution, what does it do for the common man? I don't understand the science. This is what people are asking.
Sure. Well, I can say that first of all, the terminology, I am happy to, if anybody has questions or would like to discuss these things further, I'm happy to. I'll be putting together a Facebook fan page for Inspiring Honesty very soon, and questions like this will be a fantastic way. I spend a lot of time on Facebook in conversations like this, and I'm happy to field questions and have conversations like this because curiosity is fantastic. That is the birthplace of science. If humans weren't curious, there would be no such thing as science. So please, ask questions. If you don't understand the term that I use, please ask away. But unfortunately, language is, in science, it's there for a reason, and it's very well defined and exact. And I have to use some terms to make sure that I'm being accurate in what I'm stating. I try to define it in common terms when I can. But so I apologize if I got too academic at some points. I tried to write my presentation in a way that would avoid that, but what I wrote was an outline, and I went off the cuff for most of it, aside from the outline. So as far as how the pragmatic side of evolution and how it would actually help and why the common man should believe in it is, well, first of all, I'd like to frame this in the concept of why would the common man not believe in it? And I know that sounds anti-skeptical, and I'm a skeptic. I love skepticism, but the reason that I want to frame it that way is because we are having this conversation using Skype, where I am sitting in Appleton, Wisconsin, sending you a signal over coaxial through fiber optic cables down to Pensacola, Florida, and people anywhere in the world can be watching this live as I speak. That is technology, that is science, that is a very, very advanced, application of science. And science is a process, and it is a very well understood and determined process. So when somebody doubts a whole realm of science without having the education to make these kind of criticisms, it calls into question the motive of why we are doubting it. And I think a lot of times that is to preserve the belief that we have and to resolve the conflict that we perceive. So if somebody trusts the rest of science that they don't understand, I don't have the slightest idea how my computer works, but I use it all the time. And I trust the scientists that make this computer really know what they're doing. So in that, on the pragmatic side, it is a very useful theory, and I'm making an argument from authority here, that as a biologist, I can tell you it's an extremely useful theory. As somebody who's worked in healthcare, it's an extremely useful theory. But beyond that, there are practical applications to your life. If you own a pet, a dog or a cat, I love dogs. As I think I mentioned last time I was on your show, cats, but love dogs. And those are very, very concrete examples of evolution in action, how it's been selected. But that's a pretty superficial example. A far more concrete example, something that works, is way more applicable to people's lives, is similar to the banana. Agriculture. Agriculture is the process of selective breeding in a way that we have control of the evolutionary process. So what we've done with creating the super fruits that you see, the very healthy, a very large beefeater tomatoes versus aroma tomato, a sweet corn versus a feed corn, or there's so many different kinds and varieties of food, and all of these have been created through selective breeding and intentional direction of evolution. As far as the natural evolution side of it, this is really important to talk about health care. Things like antibiotic resistance. Again, antibiotics in general, they work because of how we understand that evolution works. This is how we can discover new medications, new antibiotics. This is how we can discover cures for things or vaccines for things. Vaccines are very, very strongly associated with evolution, and that's why we have booster shots. The entire immune system is associated with evolution, but also the idea that we can derive cures from things from other organisms, from other animals. That depends very strongly on the theory of common descent. If we did not share similar genetic makeups and have the common ancestry that we do, there is no reason to assume that we could take something from a shark or from a tree and use that in a way that's therapeutic to humans with gene therapy or any other kind of therapy, but we can. That's all because evolution is true and accurate. If it weren't, we couldn't do that. So those are natural experiments and ways to demonstrate that it is indeed true.
I want to ask one last question before we bring Bob Greaves in to the conversation. This comes from another viewer. Is there actually evidence that evolution, as you say, has no guarantee of leading to intelligent or improved life design? And I emphasize ultimately.
Well, I guess this would be one of those questions that begs the question, similar to my conversation with Eric Hovind last week, where I think it's driving to a point, but I cannot say that there is anything that definitively states that no, evolution does not ultimately lead to intelligence. However, given that there are somewhere around 6 million known, or no, 3 million known species on the planet, named and identified species, and that's considered to be likely a fraction of what actually exists. 1 to maybe 10 of the species have any sufficient level of intelligence for that to be significant, and they all happen to be of a common lineage, means that that's probably a pretty random event. What happened with us is that being smart helped because of some random fluctuation in our environment, or the fact, being smart doesn't do a whole lot unless you can do this. Opposable thumbs are very, very useful along with intelligence. That gives us the ability to use tools, which again, intelligence is very useful for. A dog does not benefit from the level of intelligence and consciousness that we do because they have a mouth as a tool. They are better to have instincts, predatory instincts. So it does not appear to have any sort of direction. And the fact that a tiny, 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 tiny infinitesimal fraction of all life has any remarkable amount of intelligence seems pretty solid evidence that evolution, the tree of life, the branches that lead in every direction, has a tiny twig that's leading towards a greater intelligence. And I'd say that that's pretty strong evidence that that's not the direction that all evolution is going towards.
I'd like to bring Bob Greaves into the conversation. Bob, are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can. What do you think about Greg's presentation tonight?
It was fabulous. I've got a bit of an echo, but awesome, Greg. You did a great job. I thought it was very coherent, very easy to follow. And I thought that you mentioned a great number of issues that brought it together from so many different angles that I just I want to commend you. I thought it was an excellent presentation, and the way in which we have learned so much about life here on the planet is just amazing and impressive. And I also thought it was very impressive that you demonstrated, as far as I could see, a very strong grasp of what it was you were talking about. And so I admire that, and I thought it was just tremendous and awesome, and very very sensible and very reasonable. So I liked it. I was very impressed with it all.
Thank you. You've got me blushing here.
Now, Bob, I'd like for you to speak to this, if you would. Those of us who have been theists for a long time, most of us have rejected the whole idea of evolution, and yet today I stand very much in the position of being very comfortable and confident with the theory of evolution. And I think you do also. And so how can we
Definitely
encourage parents who are homeschooling their children to get involved in actually looking at what Greg taught tonight?
Well, that's a difficult thing to do because so much of what we deal with involves, our biases, but also our fear. For some reason, religion has created this environment of fear where we actually think that what we understand about God, about his presence, somehow absolutely depends upon making sure that all the ways we have talked about it are never violated or challenged. And I think that's a very false view of theology. I think that the scientific process and the scientific method that Greg just amazingly well talked about has showed that what even Greg, as a biologist, knows today about evolution is, light years ahead of what, say, a biologist 200 years ago would have understood about evolution, just given all the things we know and have learned. And in a similar way, I think that we have somehow turned this concept of the reality of a God into something that cannot be something we discover. It has to be something we already know, already have figured out. And I think that bias of religion causes those people who have found faith in God, who have been touched by that love, to instinctively feel, I now need to just plant my heels in the ground and go screaming and dragging and refusing to be pulled away from what it is we already know. And that, to me, is the bias and the prejudice of a very false religion. And I think that it's responsible for the reason why scientists who've been doing, in most cases, an excellent job of discovering the reality and wonder in which we find ourselves living, have been opposed and abused by people who are theists, who want to somehow perceive this as a problem. And I don't see it as a problem. And I see many ways in which the reality of God still fits into the picture without having to contradict a single thing that the world of science is doing for us.
I think that theists over the years have proved to me in my lifetime that it's almost next to impossible, it seems, to get theists to even accept what the Bible actually is. And when it comes to science that is outside of linguistic science, and we're getting into biology here, it's extremely hard or difficult for them simply because of the way that they've been trained. I like what Richard Dawkins presented several years ago. He was talking about the gene pool and the meme pool, and I'm quite convinced that meme pool has really kept people blinded. And I would like for you to speak concerning that, both of you guys. First of all, Greg, would you speak to that?
speak to the gene pool and the meme pool
Correct.
idea?
Yeah.
Well, the idea of the pool is an evolutionary concept.
Okay, I can't hear Greg. Could someone adjust his audio? I need some better audio there.
Are we doing better now?
Yes, we're doing much better now. I'm just trying to keep everything going audio-wise. Go ahead. Because my intention is to make sure that this is put in various places. I want to help homeschoolers. And I hope you can understand my heart. So many homeschoolers don't have the advantage of hearing these basics that you're presenting tonight. That's why I didn't want to interrupt anything. I did not want to have a debate here. I simply wanted to have a presentation and really compliment and have a theist like Bob come on and say, yes, I'm applauding this. And we're trying to encourage people to be intellectually honest. And I think this is a wonderful step forward. So go for it, Greg.
Well, I did want to say on the note, I just wanted to make a quick comment on the homeschooling thing. I appreciate the opportunity to do something like this. I hope it can make a difference. I know, just personally myself, I was recently, I spent a lot of time around a family with 5 young girls, and a very, very, very fundamentalist Christian family. The girls they are homeschooled. They have a 6th child on the way, and the oldest is 9. So, I mean, every seed is sacred. And I understand the practicality of homeschooling in that respect. But the idea of homeschooling for Christian reasons, it so frequently manifests around avoiding them learning the theory of evolution. And there's certain other ideas that are thought to be detrimental or even blasphemous that come about within liberal education, but I think is a very important thing that we don't stop children from gaining access to information, and that they need to have adequate sources of information. And I am a huge advocate for free inquiry, that there is not any question that shouldn't be askable, or that we should be afraid of the answers for. So on my little soapbox there for a moment, I wanted to say that. But the thing that you had asked about specifically was the idea of the gene pool and the meme pool, and how thoughts and ideas evolve as well. And that is very strongly represented, as I mentioned, in language, with the linguistic tree of life as well. How we can see not only, and this is what's interesting with languages and memes versus with biological concepts of evolution, is that not only do they evolve on their own, but they intermingle. They crossbreed. They duplicate in different ways. Ideas. What's interesting about an idea is I can give an idea away, and I can still have it myself. They're the only things that can be infinitely duplicated, and they're also infinitely mutatable, and almost absolutely mutatable. It's almost impossible for me to convey an idea to anybody and have them grasp full understanding of that idea in exactly the way I intended to convey it. So that is the idea of a meme. A meme is an idea. I mean, the word meme is a meme in itself. It's something that is a thought gene that is transmitted through cultural inheritance and passed on through interaction between people. And I think that it's a revolutionary idea, or a revolutionary way of thinking about thought and about culture and sociology on that. And it's a very biological concept of doing it. But aside from that, my only real exposure to it is from some pretty basic reading on that. I know how incredible the idea is, but Bob, if you know any more about that, feel free to share your understanding of it as well.
Well, I'm not entirely familiar with Richard Dawkins' use of the phrase "mean pool," but by that he's talking about the evolution of meaning, which I gather from the way you've even been talking about it. I think that one way in which you and I would be a little bit different, Greg, is that it was asked, do we think that intelligent life is necessarily somehow built into evolution, and based on the fact that very few creatures possess intelligence, I would even add that maybe too few human beings. I think that from a standpoint of the randomness, or if we're going to use that word loosely, in evolution, that chances are that if we could start evolution all over again from the very first organism that had life, I think it's highly likely that the result of that would be something radically different than what we have today. Radically different. But I'm certainly one of these people who is both an evolutionist and a creationist. I think that God would have been somebody intelligent enough to have been able to understand a wide variety of combinations and permutations that were possible. I get the impression that it's possible, and I certainly can't compel it, that God may have created the entire universe in midstream, as it were, with the presence of age as a universe totally and completely consistent as one that had begun with a big bang and in which life had formed and then finally got to the point in which it's at, and specifically chose this one because it was going to work for his purposes. But it is still based upon a very real physical reality and a biological evolution that would underlie it. Now, the truth about that can never be known, never be compelled, whatever. But it is interesting to note that we as human beings have arrived at a point where meaning is something we not only seem to be able to grasp, something we strive for, and something we don't thrive without. That's a curious reality, and strikes me as being a monkey wrench in the considerations that cause us to take pause. But it's not enough of a monkey wrench that we actually know how we tweak that in or out.
Now, in Richard Dawkins' work, when he was treating the gene pool and the meme pool, he did use the term meme in various ways, and so in a sense, he was
okay.
His usage was very much like the term knowledge was played with by Eric Hovind the other night, and so it's quite strange that is in his work. However, one of the things that struck me was the idea that he said, if you're from India, you're probably going to turn out to be a Hindu, and if you're from Iraq, a Muslim, if you're from America, possibly a Christian. And he was talking about memes in that kind of context. Okay. Yeah. And so, the reasons that we do believe X, Y, and Z, they simply are there, and we're conditioned by the environment, etc. And so that's basically what he was talking about. Let's move a little bit.
Can I just then respond just a little bit?
Sir.
Yeah, at first I couldn't hear what you were saying, and I thought you said mean pool. Okay. I didn't hear you say meme pool. That M sounded like an enemy. It's interesting to note, though, that here we are, we're people who believe in Christians, and yet this was a concept that came from the Middle East. I think I do, however, think that a great deal of our religion, as it were, becomes overly culturally burdened. And I to be honest with you, my concept of God as a Christian is far more generic than it is doctrinally specific.
There is a philosophy, or possibly a doctrine, and I'd like to get both you and Greg to address this. It's normally called nemine, actually coming from nothing. What is your position, Bob, on the idea that God possibly created something out of nothing, and also you, Greg, something coming from nothing into something?
what an incredible paradox. I mean, it sounds almost oxymoronic to suggest and oxymoronic to dismiss. If what is here seemed to be on a trajectory of having started at some point in time, that's one of the reasons why we have this Big Bang concept. But it's not as if we're entirely without other processes of fluctuation of matter and mass and energy. But if in some ways it's basically an if game, I would wonder that, if we are here, it's got started somehow, and it seems difficult to understand how it could have been always there. One seeks for, and it would have to have originally been from nothing. And in fact, there's even some concepts of string theory that even suggest that it is the manipulation of multiphasal forms of nothingness that actually form the illusion of the particles that we have as they go in and out of different dimensions to appear to be something. And by the time you add it all up, it's nothing. Still nothing. Everything's made of nothing. And to me, it just boggles the mind. But I have no problem in recognizing that if there has been a creation, that it all really came from, at least in terms of energy and matter, from nothing.
Greg?
Well, I would say that logically there's only two situations that are possible. Given the anthropic principle, which is the idea that we're here, so we can assume it happened at least once. And that generally is applied to life, but it can be applied to the universe, to existence itself. The fact that we exist means that things exist, and that's a pretty solid assumption that we can make. That would be known as the anthropic principle again. But from there's only two things that we can assume, and one of them is that things have always existed, or it's that things had a beginning, that something came from nothing. And I don't necessarily know which would be the more accurate. I'd say I do tend to believe the concepts of string theory and some of the other cosmological theories that are more about phase shift, or like Nick talked about on our show a few weeks ago, the idea of universes coming from black holes within a multiverse, and the possibility of eternal existence and simply phase shifting or transitioning from one gravitational source to another. So I don't know exactly, but yes, it is possible that theoretically possible that things came from nothing, that there was nothing and then there became something, and we don't know exactly why. The idea of that being a divine creator is a regression that I have trouble with, because if we say, well, this was created by a creator, well, then that wasn't nothing. That was something. This creator was something. So either that creator must be eternal, or the universe was eternal, or the creator had a start. And if we take that back to the infinite regression, well, if we say maybe that creator was created by another creator, eventually the creator always existed. And if the creator can have always existed or have come from nothing, then the same exact principle can be applied to the universe without the need for a creator. And that same exact principle can come to life.
And we are getting flooded with questions, believe it or not, and I think that's a positive sign. We can't get to all of them. Bob, you needed to make a point.
Oh, I just want to say that I think Greg makes an excellent point, and that this can get argued every way from Sunday, and the truth is that it becomes problematic when we begin to go toward origin. I think there are serious problems with every suggestion we can make. There really are, because they're first of all undemonstrable. There are a number of variations on the theme, and we end up, I think, if we're trying to do it from a standpoint of knowledge and what we can know, we basically find ourselves having reached such a pinpoint. There's just nothing you can do with it, and it has to have been something. We just can't really determine what it was.
If God created a young world with the impression of old, wouldn't reason lead us to conclude that God is deceptive?
I don't think so. I think that that's usually an accusation made by people who don't want to admit to evolution and don't like the compromise. Deception, I'm sorry, the entire universe is extremely complex. And if one wants to understand how a God could create something in total ecological, biological, and physical balance, I'm sorry, but when you begin thinking that this is something you're going to understand, and if it doesn't work the way you're going to understand it, you want to say, well, this is deceptive. The whole concept strikes me as being way presumptuous. I have no idea how such a creation could happen, and it's certainly the existence of the universe is something way beyond my capacity to make sense of exactly how it should have been done. It's almost I think it's a well-intended question, but I think it is perhaps inadvertently arrogant almost.
Greg, the same question.
I would disagree with Bob. I would say that it is fundamentally deceptive in the way that the universe exists today. Now, obviously, if somebody is creating something that is to be a fully functional machine, say, for example, you need the energy to be existent to a level and the physical laws to be there for a level, then there might be an age that it needs to be created with sufficient age. Similar to if you were creating a human from scratch, if you were making it out of dust, you would not create an infant. You would create an adult, somebody capable of caring for themselves. And it makes sense to create something with age in that respect. However, would you create a human with a belly button so that they had the perception that they had been born with an umbilical cord in infancy? Would you create them with scars from their childhood, with memories of a childhood that they never had? I'd say that's deceptive. And
I think we have to go back farther than that. I think we have to go back to a point prior to human beings even being the image of God. If there was, I mean, I don't stand on this. I certainly wouldn't defend this idea. But I mean, either we took billions of years from a Big Bang and ended up waiting for a point when it would be reasonable, or we began at some point prior to the species that we are becoming endowed with humanity. Just to cut to the chase, and the sense is that. Who cares? That it happened one way or the other. And I don't think that it's necessarily deceptive in that because it would have taken place at a point before we even entered the picture. I'm under the impression that it's quite likely that this evolution that takes place, and finally we get to the point where man is, and I think the opposable thumbs probably came first. The opposable thumbs made intelligence useful. And that there came a point where there was this creature that was then, I think, endowed by God with humanity, with the image, and that we move from there. But that the stories are just stories, that try to describe it, so that by the time we finally arrive on the scene, we're already here in a sense biologically.
Last question. Is believing that matter was always there any more absurd than believing that matter was created by a God who has always been there?
Well, I wanted to touch back on the last one. When I was talking about human creation and the idea of belly buttons and scars in a childhood, I was using that allegorically. What I was talking about was things like fossils, dinosaurs. things that would not be necessary, things that existed before
They
humans
would be
existed.
totally necessary, Greg, because you have to have a world that's fully in balance. And I'm talking about cutting to the chase. When you cut to the chase, you don't like create a facade like a movie scene would, where you have buildings that don't really have rooms in them. That would strike me as deceptive. I think that God created, it's just, cutting to the chase, that's all, but it would still be required to have a complete and thorough balance and a real history, yeah.
As long as we make it flexible as to when the creation occurred, I can understand that and allow for it to not be deceptive. I think that if it was recent enough, then it would have a degree of deception involved. But there's a gradient of deception, I guess, and eventually it goes away entirely. But to get to the question at hand of whether it is any more absurd to believe that matter always existed, can you repeat it one more time?
Okay, here's the question, and we are running out of time. Actually, we're over time, but that's fine. Is believing that matter was always there any more absurd than believing that matter was created by a God who was always there?
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was getting it accurate. So, and my answer to that is yes. Yes, it is. And that is, again, based on the anthropic principle that I mentioned earlier. The reason that I say that is because the belief that matter was always here, or even the belief that matter spontaneously came into existence, is utilitarian in the fact that we know matter exists. It's here. Anthropically, we can say, matter, hey, it's here. Therefore, it either came from nothing, it spontaneously came into existence, or it always existed, or it existed in some other form. I mean, even energy converts into matter and whatnot, but we have to account for the existence of matter in some way. Now, to do that by creating another functional piece of this that is not necessary, because if again it's possible for something to come from nothing or for something to have always existed, such as a God, then that same possibility can be applied to matter, and we can remove God from the equation entirely without changing anything. And since
That's
we
true.
don't, there is a God, it would be removing, I mean, anthropically, or I guess it'd be parsimonious to not add something infinitely complicated to the equation. I mean, by definition, a creator God, something capable of creating all of the universe, would have to be more complicated than the universe. So I think that that's a huge logical leap to go from the matter exists, therefore matter had to either exist or had to have come into existence spontaneously, and then say that matter exists, therefore God created matter, and God either existed eternally or spontaneously came into existence. It adds something to it that is neither necessary nor very well justified.
I can agree with the logic of that. However, I don't think it is compelling. In fact, I would even be of the opinion that it would be absolutely necessary for God to create a universe in which its existence was in any manner necessary for his existence in that sense. It had to be something that could be entirely self-explanatory. I would think would have to be. First of all, if God is not, if he's neither this form of energy or that form of mass, then it has to be its own complete system. It has to be, and it is. And so I would see that. I see the problem, the conundrum, and the distance, and I just see that as necessary rather than as something that would have to be there in order for us to accept it. But at the same time, I think it does leave us in a situation where there's nothing we can do to, in any manner, demonstrate that what Greg said is in any manner incorrect.
Bob, what are your final thoughts on the advantages of studying evolution?
Oh, I think it's the advantages of studying evolution are, I think it helps us to, Greg just listed a tremendous list of advantages, from medicine to knowledge to how we understand things. Uh, I, I, I think that it's important for us to understand the wonder of the universe. And I think another advantage is as people who believe in God, we cannot be people with integrity if we're going to run away from these things that are there. You can't do it. There's no value in that. But I do think that it also it causes us to really wonder about the culmination of things, to ask ourselves, where is this headed? Is there a purpose? And by not having solid answers, it forces us, I think, to sometimes take responsibility for where we find ourselves thrown in the situation, as well as graciousness in dealing with each other. I think that Greg and I are both on the same team. We're both in the same species, and we're both on the same planet. In many ways, we are brothers, and this cannot be the kind of a thing that would divide us. And we can't, those of us who are theists, we can't hide our head in the sands and live in denial of the tremendous body of knowledge that's there.
Greg, do you think it's a benefit for theists and atheists, in a sense, to join forces and start talking here about evolution?
No, I think it's a terrible idea, and I regret ever. There's nothing better than people pursuing the truth and coming together and considering options with an open mind and an objective viewpoint, and not taking things off the table before you can get to the table. I mean, it's extremely difficult to make any progress in knowledge whatsoever if there's any questions that can't be asked or any answers that can't be considered.
Right.
You've done a wonderful job tonight. We applaud you much in every way. And I'm going to ask you, like I did at our production meeting. And by the way, I want all of you guys, all of our audience, all of our friends to know that we have a wonderful relationship with each other. And if you don't have friends who are atheists, there's something wrong with you. They're wonderful people. I'm not saying all of them are wonderful, but I think in a sense they all are. And please understand, if you're an atheist and you don't have theist friends, try it. You might like it. And so let's come together. And I'd like to ask Greg to do something that he did at our production meeting. He closed in prayer, and I loved his prayer so much. Would you do so, Greg?
I remember exactly what it is, but thank you, science, and thank you, reason, for bringing us here together today. Thank you, evolution, for bringing us to this point in life. And thank you to the sun, generating all of the energy necessary on the planet. It's been a wonderful experience. So thank you. Thank you to nature.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Greg, so much for being here. And once again, we are here at the place, and we want to see you moving forward with intellectual honesty. And I think that we have some people who are very well educated, willing to put their time and effort into simply giving not just you, but your children, your grandchildren, and everyone around you a wonderful education to where we can actually rethink things and move forward into a better future. Thank you for your time tonight.